Hello and welcome all to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation series. My name is Will. I'm the director of New Hampshire Peace Action. And in case you are new to the organization, our mission is to contribute to creating a world in which nuclear disarmament, mutual security, global understanding, international cooperation, and respect for human rights create social, economic, and environmental benefits for all. 2020 has brought us to kind of a new moment of reckoning and possibility as we've seen our economy change, as we've seen the way we think about work and life change. And through that, we have started our bi-weekly conversation series, which is live streaming on YouTube and Facebook. So if anybody's uncomfortable having your face on the internet, please turn off your video. However, you are welcome to keep your video on if you don't mind that, and we love seeing your smiling faces. Tonight we are bringing you perspectives on anti-Semitism from the only Jewish kid in town with Jenny Walkup, who I have not seen in person since I think she was in high school, or maybe the summer after high school when she did our summer youth retreats called Peace of Mind. And obviously this is a topic that can get touchy. We want to hear how you're feeling, but please try to remain respectful and civil as we get to the Q&A at the end. And of course, anybody who isn't, I am not above muting and booting. So to introduce Jenny, she's an anthropologist and organizer, and she's going to be talking to us about her story of growing up Jewish in New Hampshire and the anti-Semitism she experienced. She's going to talk about what it means to understand Jewish marginalization as not that bad, and how she came to understand the deep connections between anti-Semitic, anti-Black, and anti-poor ideologies. She's also one of the hosts of the Wedge podcast, which is no longer in syndication, sadly. But she is the author of a recent article in the Public Eye delinking anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which you can see in the chat if Jenny puts it in the chat one more time for us.
Gotcha.
So I just in kind of opening, I wanted to say that I was drawn to ask Jenny to give this presentation after she made a Facebook post that talked about some of her experiences growing up in Northwood, and I was touched, and I thought we've talked about a lot of different types of oppression and bigotry in this conversation series. But this is one that I don't, in my time at New Hampshire Peace Action, we've never talked about anti-Semitism. And it's something that I think we need to have some really deep conversations about. So when Jenny posted that article, I was touched, and I really wanted to hear more from her. So I invited her in. And before we get too much further, I'm going to just hand it off to Jenny. Jenny, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Oh, thanks. That was a really nice introduction. Thank you. So I've sort of come up with a plan for what we can talk about, and obviously it can take different directions, but what I want to do is first share with you all sort of my personal experiences and my story, and then provide a framework for how we can think about anti-Semitism, because it doesn't quite fit into the ways that we normally think about oppression, and it, clearly has reemerged really violently and really what feels like suddenly out of nowhere recently, in a way that for a lot of people just like does not make any sense, right? And didn't make any sense for me until I started thinking about it in this other way. So yeah, I also want to start by just encouraging everyone to take a deep breath and take a moment to sort of put yourself in this space, in this conversation. So just take a moment with me. So I am from Northwood. Anti-Semitism is not really something I've talked about publicly ever, at least not like my experiences, in large part because I didn't feel like it was that important. I didn't feel like it was that bad. I was definitely teased for being Jewish, and yes, sometimes that escalated in ways that were not okay. But at the same time, I didn't experience the levels of like prejudice or like systemic barring from different activities that, for instance, a Black person or a Muslim person or all kinds of other different identities might have experienced in the same town that I lived in, or anywhere. And so I didn't want to bring up my experiences because I didn't want to distract from a conversation that I thought was more important. The reason that I have more recently, come to think otherwise is because I've seen the growing violence, because I've, become scared, and because I've learned to understand all of these things is very deeply connected, and that talking about one doesn't necessarily distract from, being able to work towards another. So when I was growing up, I was the only Jewish kid in town, certainly. I think there were two other Jewish people, and one of them was my mom. So for a lot of people in town, I was the only Jewish person they knew. There's also a Jewish summer camp in Northwood. I don't want to get too deep into that, but that's mostly sort of an isolated island. People don't interact that deeply with the summer camp. Some young people do work there over the summers, just a handful. They mostly hire counselors who are, former camp goers. So some people have like that connection to knowing a couple other Jews, but for the most part, I was it. Which was really weird for me because I was also didn't know any other Jews, right? Like I knew my own family, but I was very isolated from any sort of Jewish community. There's the saying that there is many ways of being Jewish as there are Jews. And so I want to say very clearly that this is my experience and my story, which may resonate or have similarities with other people's experiences and stories. And in a lot of ways may not at all. And that's just sort of like, the complexity of humanness. But I grew up in this small town. My dad was not Jewish, is not Jewish, but my mom is. And because of the sort of matrilineal Jewish tradition, I am Jewish. But when I was younger, if someone asked me, I would tell them that I was half Jewish, half normal, right? Which obviously belies this belief that even I held that the normal thing to be, the like status quo thing to be was Christian. Or maybe secular Christian, but you're still, celebrating Christmas, celebrating Easter, doing sort of living in a secular Christian way. I didn't go to synagogue growing up. The nearest synagogue was in Concord, which is about half an hour drive. We went on the high holidays some when I was young, but we weren't, I was in school and I had to be in school during Jewish holidays. Otherwise I would miss class, and frankly, I liked school. And so I wasn't interested in that. And so it was just it would have been inconvenient for us to go to synagogue regularly. We certainly could have made that a part of our lives if we wanted to. But for the most part, my family's fairly secular. It wasn't, the religious element wasn't as important as the cultural, ethnic component, right? But despite not really knowing much of anything about what it meant to be Jewish outside of my own experience, a lot of times I was asked to represent Jews for, a classroom of other students. Basically once a year, at least, whenever the Christmas party would come around, right? There'd be a tree, and then the teacher would say, Jenny, why don't you tell us about Hanukkah? Which, half of the time, by the time we were doing the Christmas party was, had been over for a couple days or wasn't coming for a while because it sort of floats around on the regular calendar. One year, a teacher said something that absolutely mortified me. I was in the 4th grade, a time when you do not typically want to be seen or stand out. And the teacher said, oh, and we have Hanukkah. Jenny, well, she didn't say Hanukkah, she said Hanukkah. Jenny and Jews everywhere celebrate Hanukkah, and asked me to come to the front of the room and tell, you know, the same kids that had heard me do the same thing every year for however many years about this holiday. And I think it was a genuine attempt at inclusion, but it really, after, you know, many years of doing it, started to feel like tokenization, right? And there were ways that this differentness that I perpetually had, no matter what I did about it and how, you know, much a part of the community I was, would come out, right? And I would be teased in ways that I think were actually like fairly harmless. You know, there were some students would like just make little jokes like, oh, Jenny's Jewish. They called when I was in high school, all the high school kids called my car, which was a Subaru, the Jubaru. Sort of stupid things, right? But little things that cumulatively indicated that my Jewishness was something that made me separate from the norm. And then there were things that were more problematic. In middle school, about students started pulling spare change out of their pockets and sort of scattering it on the ground in front of me, with the suggestion that, well, Jews are greedy and Jenny will pick it up because that will demonstrate that she is a greedy Jew. This is also something that happened to my mom when she was in school. It is one of the most common things I hear when I'm talking with other Jewish people about things they experienced in school if they didn't go to a Jewish school. They went to, you know, a public school or something like that. That culminated really in high school when our sociology teacher actually took a pocket full of change out of his pocket and threw it at me in class as a sort of experiment to see if I would pick it up. I think I did, which I probably shouldn't have, but I didn't really have the wherewithal to know what to do about that. And then there was, you know, Holocaust jokes. And that was actually, for me, I think a little bit harder to deal with. I remember we went on a field trip in the 8th grade. It's this big field trip. You go up to the Appalachian Mountain Club Center and, you know, everyone goes on a hike. And at the end of the hike, there's this huge 4-foot fireplace and we're all dripping wet, just covered in rain, having come down the mountain. Very cold and huddled up by the fireplace. And one of the students decided it was funny to suggest that they were going to push me into the fireplace and burn me alive. Just, you know, like the Holocaust, which they didn't use fireplaces in that way to my knowledge, but that was definitely the reference. That was something that people thought was very funny, lived on for a long time in jokes land. There was also a time, maybe a year later, where a group of sort of neighborhood kids was messing with me, and they, you know, were calling me ugly and asking me why my nose was so big and crooked. And I thought I would shut them up by saying, oh, well, I'm Jewish and that's why I look this way. Because I knew that's what they were sort of getting at. I thought they would then feel a sense of liberal guilt and be quiet, but instead they decided to do kicking and punching at me, which was very not cool. But for the most part, a lot of what I experienced was really just little jokes every day, or occasionally little asides that demonstrated that the way that people thought of me was as someone who was, yes, a part of the community, but always a little bit different, always a little bit off to the side, right? And I always knew that if push came to shove, I could be pulled out of a crowd as the only Jewish kid in town. But again, none of these things really added up to being dangerous for the most part, to stopping me from doing the things I wanted to do, from going to college, from, getting the education that I wanted to get. a lot of the stereotypes that I heard and saw were about Jews being kind of smart or Jews being kind of wealthy. And I thought, well, these things aren't necessarily true in my experience, but not a bad stereotype to live with on a personal level. I never wanted to make a big stink about it because at the end of the day, I was still white, right? I still passed as white. I had all of the white privileges. So it didn't feel like a big deal. As I got older, a few years ago, I moved to Pittsburgh and I started to become friends with a sort of leftist Jewish community there that became my chosen family. And I remember one of the first people I met there saying to me, like when we met, I said, hey, I'm Jewish, but I'm not that Jewish. And that he looked at me and he was like, that's really, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear. Will, am I allowed to swear? Okay, so he looked at me and he said, that's fucked up. Like you cannot, you have to knock that out of your vocabulary. Because what you're saying is that you're a little bit Jewish, but if someone were more Jewish or had more Jewish characteristics or more like Jewish stereotypical characteristics, that would not be okay. And so the reason that you're saying that is to separate yourself from the rest of the Jewish community. And he was right. And, you know, a few years later, when the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was shot up, I don't know a better way to say that. And that was the synagogue that I knew the most people who went to. I realized that all of these little things that set Jewish people apart that I had never really wanted to talk about or make a fuss about were actually really important and really dangerous. And I wanted to understand how it was that things had sort of gotten so out of control so quickly. So I think we can pause for a second. If you guys have questions, I'm happy to answer them. And then I want to walk you through what I think is a good framework for understanding how that happens. So I think, Will, what do you think is the best way to take questions? If people want to put them in the chat or?
Yeah, if folks want to put your questions in the chat, I can read them out. The other option is you can either raise your hand or post in the chat that you'd like to be recognized, and you're welcome to speak and unmute yourself after Jenny or I have asked you to go ahead. So Jenny, could you just review one more time? Where are you headed with this? Because I do have questions that I want to ask, but I don't want to step into the material you're going to cover already.
So let's go where we're headed then, and we'll circle back around to questions. Does that make the most sense to people? I'm seeing nods. Yes, okay. So one of the things, oh my goodness, that I was thinking was, you know, not everyone is as attuned to the tropes of what anti-Semitism is and can look like as someone who's Jewish. And so I wanted to first go over what those common tropes are so that folks who might not be as aware can be on the lookout for them. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'm gonna, okay. So common anti-Semitic tropes. And I want to be clear that these are like still very prevalent. All of these pictures are from like the past couple years. Puppet master or some sort of like secret controlling group. For instance, you have this Trump ad where Bernie Sanders is depicted as being a puppet master controlling Joe Biden, which, you know, would be nice, but it's not the case. There's also this story of disloyalty or dual loyalty, that Jewish people are not loyal to the place that they're in because they're loyal first to the Jewish community. This comes up a lot when people are talking about Israel now. People say like, oh, well, the Jews are really loyal to Israel. They're not loyal to the US or not loyal to the communities that they live in. Greed, very common. Blood libel. This is kind of a deep cut. I'm going to say you don't see it that often, except blood libel is the idea that Jewish people drink the blood of Christian babies. Except we're seeing it reemerge again now with the QAnon conspiracy. So I think if you keep an eye out for blood libel tropes, you will see more and more of them. Depictions of Jewish people as rats, snakes, animals with tentacles, dogs. There are unfortunately some people who still believe that Jews have horns. So these are things, sort of tropes, themes to keep an eye out for that have like deep anti-Semitic roots. And then there are things like, Holocaust denial, support of Hitler, etc. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a way to think about anti-Semitism, and understand how it works. So it can be really hard to wrap our heads around anti-Semitism because it doesn't really fit into our popular understanding of oppression, right? The way that we understand oppression comes out of this post-colonial theory where there's an oppressor and an oppressed. You have basically a binary power relationship where one group has power over another group. You have a top and a bottom. So for instance, you have white people on top, black people on the bottom. You have men on top, women on the bottom, right? And there are, of course, ways that this is presents in sort of like confounding ways. So for instance, you have the like trope of the perfect mother held up on a pedestal. But we generally understand that that trope is in service to the sort of general phenomenon of men with power, women without power, right? So that's the general shape of how we understand prejudice and oppression. Anti-Semitism doesn't quite fit into this framework because it operates by placing Jews in the middle of binary oppressions, namely of the binary oppressions of race and of wealth or class power. So I want to offer another framework which can help us understand anti-Jewish oppression or anti-Semitism and understand why it's erupted so violently so recently. So this framework comes from JFRIJ, which is Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and from If Not Now, which is a Jewish anti-occupation group. Both groups do great work, and I think if you are not familiar with them, definitely worth looking into. And I think this is a really valuable sort of analysis. So, how is it that anti-Jewish oppression can seem to be invisible or dormant for such a long period of time? And unfortunately, if you understand it in this way, that's a feature, not a bug, right? That's part of how it works intentionally. So the point of anti-Jewish oppression is to keep Jewish face at the front of power. So that Jews, instead of whoever's actually, the ruling classes, are the target for people's rage when they become angry at the system. So for that to happen and be credible, Jews need to be given a relative success and relative class mobility compared to other minority groups so that they can be, credibly seen as the ones in charge. This means that Jews get positions like landlord, teacher, some cases banker or lawyer, not actually the people at the very tip of the sort of power structure, but people in the mid-range. This also means that anti-Semitism is cyclical, right? It's a cycle. Violent bursts tend to come in waves. They come just after things seem to be the calmest, just after Jews seem to be the most assimilated. In, some of the most famous cases of Jewish genocide, this has been the case. So we're talking about like Weimar Germany. Jews were considered to be one of the most assimilated minority groups. Same in medieval Spain before, oh my gosh, I'm losing the word, with the horses and the sticks. Okay, medieval Spain.
The Inquisition.
Thank you so much. Yes. So the function of this is that it ultimately makes the ruling classes invisible. And it protects the power structures that actually keep people down by diverting energy and anger towards the Jews, who are in a sort of middleman role. This isn't always something that comes completely from the top down. Certainly has been. There have been like very explicit plans to do this. But when something like tropes about Jews being greedy, about Jews having all of the money, being part of a secret cabal, etc., are pervasive in society, it can seem like common sense, and it can come as a sort of grassroots uprising against Jews. So, phase one, Jews are separated from other exploited groups, geographically, socially, occupationally, and barred from certain trades. They're allowed relative amounts of social or economic mobility compared to other oppressed groups. An example of this is ghettoization. Jews in Algeria were actually given French citizenship before Muslims were. I would say that this is the phase that we were in when I was in high school, where I was being separated in these little ways that didn't seem that big of a deal from everyone else socially. So then the next phase, other oppressed groups are encouraged by those in power to channel their anger at Jews. Jews is their ultimate source of exploitation. And this is in part because Jews are the most immediate people to be identified as oppressors. You get slumlords in the projects, for instance. Then, when there are moments of revolt, Jews get blamed. This is the most dangerous and violent phase of this cycle, right? We get scapegoated, we get targeted, again, whether intentionally or sort of spontaneously from the grassroots. I would say this is the Holocaust, this is your Charlottesville, this is your Inquisition, this is your Tree of Life, right? People targeting Jews because they believe them to be the source of their own oppression. And then, in this fourth phase, which is really tricky, I think, for me to think about, because it's really easy to blame Jewish people for their own oppression when you think about this phase without having part, I guess. So in hopes of gaining safety, you know, afraid, traumatized, having just gone through, potentially, this wave of violence, Jews have the opportunity to cooperate with the ruling class or with the ruling ideology and to gain themselves some measure of safety in so doing. In the case of the United States, the ruling ideology is white supremacy. In the case of the United States, that means that white passing Jews have to abandon or like denounce Black Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Jews of color, in order to gain that safety. This also keeps Jews from seeing our own liberation as tied up with the liberation of other people, because we're given this opportunity for moderate success, for moderate mobility, for moderate safety, in exchange for basically throwing other people under the bus. And if you come from a history of trauma, if you don't see this as a cycle that's repeating over and over again, if you're just experiencing this in the span of one lifetime, it can seem like that's the only choice you have, right? So I want to share with you this quote from April Rosenblum, and then we can have an open discussion and take questions. So April says, that's the nature of anti-Jewish oppression, to cover up the roots of injustice, to make people think they've figured out who's really pulling the strings. And this is one of the biggest reasons why it's important for social justice movements to figure out and confront anti-Jewish oppression, for the movement's own sake, because anti-Jewish oppression is designed as a way to keep people from understanding where the power really lies, and it works. So I'm gonna stop share. We have a couple questions, and then, yeah, we can just talk openly. I have at the end just sort of a couple of thoughts on the ways that I have seen anti-Semitism play out in activist groups on the left, and some advice for how to avoid those things and sort of keep an eye out for them. But until then, I'm seeing a couple questions here.
All right. Jenny, if I can interject, just so that folks watching on Facebook Live who can't see the chat, I'll read the questions out loud. And also, if you are watching on Facebook Live, you can feel free to leave questions on the New Hampshire Peace Action Facebook page, and I'll get them here so that Jenny can answer them. Sorry to jump in there. Just wanted to. So I'm going to go ahead and read John's question. So I'm curious about your sociology teacher. Did he really believe that horrible stereotype, or was he trying to see how your classmates would react to his anti-Semitism? To clarify, was he faking it for the sake of a sociology experiment?
You know, I don't know, and I'm not really sure it matters, is what I would have to say. He wasn't really teaching us sociology. I didn't learn a single sociological thing in that class. I learned a lot of stories about him and his wife. I learned, yeah, like I didn't learn any sociology at all. Not like one thing. Which is a bummer because I really wanted to learn sociology. I think he thought it was funny. I think that he really wanted to be the fun, cool teacher, and doing something that was a little off color, a little surprising, appealed to him in that way.
Next question is also from a different John. Thank you, Jenny. Have you watched Unorthodox on Netflix or read the book? And if so, what is your reaction?
I have not watched Unorthodox. I don't have my own reaction. What I can tell you is that from talking with other Jewish people who have, a lot of people have been very uncomfortable with the way that it portrays the Orthodox community. And yeah, I thought it was really problematic.
John, did you want to weigh in a little bit on why you asked the question, and what about Unorthodox made you wanted you to bring it forward here?
Well, I had mixed feelings watching it. I mean, on one hand, you root for it's about a young woman growing up in an ultra-Orthodox community in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which is the center in New York City, I understand, and her trying to break away from it. You know, so you're kind of torn between two things. Is her and she's 19 and she's married in an Orthodox, you know, relationship, and there's one element of that is abusive, and then the other element of, you know, it's a community, and I don't, you know, it's hard to. Not being Jewish, it's kind of hard to get a line on it, like, you know, what is the message here?
Yeah, I think I'm not Orthodox, so just to be super clear, there's different, you know, types of ways to be Jewish and different, like, sort of seriousnesses about the religious element. I would say that I'm secular, which means I'm not terribly religious at all, but I do, you know, consider tradition and community to be really important. Yeah, there are things about the Orthodox Jewish community that are I really disagree with. I really disagree with the treatment of women. I really disagree with the sort of strict gender roles and gender rules. At the same time, I have spent time with Orthodox people and in like Orthodox people's homes that have been really magical and really powerful, because you have a community of people who all have, you know, a seriousness of faith, who are, I mean, it's a very tight-knit community, right? And it can be really loving and feel really wonderful and, yeah, magical and supportive in certain ways. But in the same way as like any culture, there are ways in which that is really problematic and can be really sort of controlling and toxic when there are certain rules or like ways of living that are expected of you. But I can't comment on the movie because I didn't watch it, because I heard it was made people feel uncomfortable, basically, just as you said.
So seeing that there aren't any questions written and nobody's raising a hand, I'm going to jump in and ask some of the questions that have been on my mind. Amy, did you have something? You can go ahead.
Okay, I haven't read that article that you and I'm really excited to. I wonder, my experience has been that there is this issue with Zionism, and this conflating of Zionism and, you know, being a Zionist and being Jewish, which I don't think is the same thing at all. Would you speak a little bit to that and how you might maybe see that as playing into the cycle that you're talking about in a worldwide stage?
Boy, can I. And I don't know if you have a way to do this, Will, but I have a sort of list of follow-up readings that I think, you know, if people are interested, might be really good reads. I don't know if you have a way to distribute that.
Sure, we can put it in our next our next upcoming events blast. We can include that in as and say for folks who caught this, read this, and for folks who didn't, still read this.
Great. So yes, there is a lot of conflating of Zionism and Jewishness. It comes from all angles. There are Jewish people who do it. I would say that like conflation is anti-Semitic on the grounds that it falls into that trope of like dual loyalty, of not being loyal to or like a part of truly the community that you're in. And because it just denies the true like depth of diversity in the Jewish world. I mean, there's so many different people in the Jewish world. Zionism itself comes out of basically like an era of like early nationalist ideology where people are operating on ethno-nationalism, which, as we, you know, have discovered, not that great generally. At the same time, even in times when it feels like things are safe or like Jewish people are assimilated, there is this passed down knowledge that those are the times when you are in the most danger. You always need to be watching your back. You always need to be careful. I will tell you, like, I have a Star of David I wear constantly, often, not constantly. I don't travel with it. There are people who, you know, keep their passport and $100 under their bed in case they need it at any time. In case they need, you know, to flee, basically. So, when you know, have that passed down experience of trauma and of, you know, justified fear that you might be kicked out of the place that you live at any point in time, having a place that seems like a safe place to go, where you will not be in danger because of your ethnicity, is really enticing. Yeah, I mean, so it's really complicated because people have this really strong tie to Israel as the idea, like the sort of Platonic idea of their own safety, of a place where they can be safe and be accepted. At the same time, the way that Israel has been formed is, I mean, there's lots of different ways to say it. I would say like it's an apartheid state, frankly, in my opinion. I think it's unacceptable. I'm not, you know, I'm not interested in like supporting it. I'm not interested in, you know, I'm interested in finding ways to build that sense of safety like here, wherever I am. But yeah, I mean, it gets conflated. It gets conflated all the time. It gets conflated by like active anti-Semites. It gets conflated by Trump constantly. The education department last year, December of last year, adopted a definition of anti-Semitism, which is hotly debated, but it comes from the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, a commission, something like that, that includes anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism, as like part of the definition, which is obviously super problematic because there are Jews who are anti-Zionist. There are people who are anti-Zionist who are Palestinian and who just like want to have safety in their own land, in like the land of their ancestors in exactly the same way, right? At the same time, yeah, a lot of times when people say Zionist, what they mean is Jewish person. When they say Jewish person, what they mean is Zionist. And I think that having clarity about those words is like very critical. And, you know, separating very clearly like Jewish person and Israel and Israeli also, I think, very critical to separate and be clear about. Also, when we're talking about critiquing Zionism, being super clear about if what you're critiquing is actually Zionism or what you're critiquing is colonialism or settler colonialism, in which case the implications of that are relevant here in the US as well. And I think it's important to be clear about that terminology for that reason. Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna grab this opportunity to ask my question, which is, so I have, I think that most of the anti-Semitism that I have seen organizing on the left for the last 11 years, the people who have said things or done things have been clueless as to the implications of what they're saying or doing. Like they're not intentionally being anti-Semitic. Have you had success in organizing on the left, in talking to people in a way that they can hear it and not feel offended and defensive and walk away from that conversation?
No. I mean, so I think a lot of times anti-Semitism gets brushed off because we think, you know, it's not that important. Hey, I'm here to focus on, you know, anti-immigrant oppression. I'm here to focus on anti-Black oppression. I'm here to focus on, you know, capitalism. Whatever it is, people don't see anti-Semitism as a part of that. They see anti-Semitism as a white person's pet project, right? And therefore talking about it is a distraction, and maybe a way to like bring attention to yourself because you're Jewish, you know, and you're different. And which is why I think that understanding the relationship, I think understanding it like strategically as a part of these other oppressions is really important. But no, I have not had success with that.
So does that essentially put the impetus on white folks organizing to make sure we're calling that out when we see it, and calling people in when we see that, to have conversations about how the things that they say are playing into those tropes or ideas or oppressions?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, yes.
What else? Do folks have more questions? You can type them in the chat. We've got about 15 minutes left, so there's a little space.
I have another sort of like complicating thought on Israel and Jewishness, which is of a more personal nature, which is, I told you all that, you know, I didn't grow up with a Jewish community. I didn't know anyone my own age who was Jewish that was not like a cousin until I went to college. Straight up, like I didn't know anyone. My freshman year of college, I did go on birthright, which I know is really problematic. At the same time, that was the first time in my life where I looked around and I saw other people my own age who looked like me. It was like the first time in my life where I was confused as like a part of a group, where people like confused me with someone else in the group, right? When I came home and I showed pictures of my trip to my mom, she pointed at someone else in the picture and was like, "You look really great right here." I was like, "No, Mom, that's a group picture and I'm on the left." But that felt really good to me. It felt incredible to be a part of something, and I had never even thought that I wasn't fully a part of the communities that I was in. And I think that the draw of that feeling of connection is genuinely really powerful for people. And the way that I've been able to square that is to say, yes, like being in Jewish community is really important to me, and you know, a way that I have found to like learn and grow in myself, and you know, learn about other people and have deep connections and deep relationships. And I want to be a part of Jewish communities that are fighting oppression, right? I want to be a part of anti-occupation Jewish communities. That has not always been an option for people. And it's not an option for people everywhere. And for a lot of people, if you're in Jewish community, you maybe like work at some sort of like Jewish organization, maybe it's a nonprofit, whatever. If you say something openly that is critical of Israel, you can risk your job. You can be risking your relationship with your parents, with family, your, you know, your synagogue membership. It's very risky. And it can be really hard to speak out about those things.
Could you quickly explain what a birthright trip is for folks who might not know?
Okay, so Birthright is a is a trip that's funded in about a quarter by the Israeli government and about 3/4 by donations, a lot of them from Sheldon Adelson, that is available to young American, well, not even American, young diaspora Jews. They've been spreading and spreading who is available for the trip, but it is a free 10-day trip to Israel. It's basically a propaganda trip. There are two components to this propaganda. One is and it's very explicit. This is not, I mean, you can read Birthright's materials, they will tell you this. They want young Jewish people to have a connection to Israel. They want people to consider making Aliyah, which is moving to Israel, taking Israeli citizenship. And that does, if you're young, require joining the IDF. They want people to politically support Israel if they do stay, you know, where they live. The second part is they really, really want to reinforce something that's called continuity. And continuity means Jewish people having babies with other Jewish people and falling in love and getting married. And this is very much a fear coming out of the Holocaust. I mean, on my trip, they explicitly said, like, if we go out of existence because we aren't raising Jewish children, then Hitler won. Right? Like, that is explicitly the argument for continuity. And there's all kinds of like continuity programs that are basically like dating programs for young Jews. But that is another major component of Birthright, or a major component of the agenda. I'm seeing one from Marsha. Will, can I read it?
Go for it.
Marsha's asking if I went to the youth camp, which I think she's talking about Camp Yavna, which is the summer camp I mentioned earlier. The answer is no. Camp Yavna is very expensive. So my mom looked into putting me into the summer camp when I was young. It is like $4,000 for a 2-week stay. She was like, nah, perfectly reasonably, I think. When I was older, I was in college, I worked at Camp Yavna as one of the there's a couple positions that you can be hired into as someone who lives in Northwood, or like a sort of townie kid. One of them is cleaning crew, and another one is working at the daycare center. So I worked at the daycare center one summer. They did not know what to do with me because all of their staff who they were used to having in that position were not Jewish. So there's this really clear separation between, these kids who grew up going to this summer camp and then became counselors, and basically the service staff who live in the town. I really messed up that dichotomy for them. They kept inviting me to go to like synagogue on Saturdays, and I was like, Saturdays is my one day off. There's no way I'm coming back here. I also have, I will say that I think that Camp Yavna's way of operation has a lot to do with perpetuating anti-Semitic stereotypes in the town, because they pay a stipend for the summer for the people that work there, which is what most summer camps do, right? The stipend is usually way lower than the amount of work that you actually put in, but people agree to do it because they get to spend the summer at a place they love and have fond memories. If you're a counselor, you know, it's like a big party all summer long with all your best friends. But the effect of stipending, you know, local people to work is that people are getting drastically underpaid working there. And there's a lot of ritual that, it's an Orthodox friendly summer camp, I would say. So there are things, you know, they say a prayer before they eat, they have, you know, Friday night dinners, etc., that are like really confusing to people who don't know. And so they sort of come away with this idea of like, oh, those Jews, they're mystical and greedy. So I think that Yavna has a lot of work to do in that department.
So Jenny, do you want to do your closing, and then I'm going to take the last couple minutes to tell people about our upcoming programs. But there's one more question. And it's, have you noticed a decrease, increase, or any evolution of attitudes towards Jews as time has gone by, either positive or negative?
Yeah, I noticed there's a lot more white supremacy. It's been getting worse. It's been getting worse, you know, for the past 5 years, pretty drastically, I think. And, you know, you can look at, you know, hate crime incidents going up drastically. You can look at, you know, all kinds of different metrics for that, but I think it's been clearly getting worse. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen one more time. Okay. So I was not sure what to label this slide, because I don't always think it's mistakes. I think sometimes it's ignorance. I think it's all sorts of different things. But these are the common sort of like themes of anti-Semitism that I tend to see in people on the left. I also want to be super clear. There is this push by alt-right Zionists, basically, to suggest that all of the anti-Semitism in the US is coming from the left and it's super dangerous. And I would say that's a complete misdirect. Pretty much all of the violent anti-Semitism is coming from the alt-right. And misdirecting away from that is absolutely a failure. But I do think it's important to figure out the ways that we can root this out in our own organizing. One, so Jewish people who, you know, have a cultural legacy of being very strong organizers, actually, feel comfortable in our movements. And because, again, I think that anti-Semitism operates as a pressure valve that releases tension for the, you know, the ruling class, and misdirects it away from where it actually needs to go for us to make change. So one, we already talked about, the conflation of Jews and Israel. I think the way to combat this is to be very clear and very thoughtful about language, and to just say, you know, correct people when they say Zionists and they mean Jews, or more frequently when they mean Jews and they say Zionists. That might be the same thing. I also see it as, you know, if you're doing a Jewish event and everything is blue and white, those are the colors of the Israeli flag. They have no like resonance beyond that. I don't think were Jewish colors before 1948. I don't think that they should be used to represent Jews worldwide all the time. Very annoying. This also comes up with the idea that Jews all support Israel and are therefore bad until otherwise proven. The way this manifests most of the time is I'll walk into a space, someone will realize I'm Jewish, I'll be, wearing something, or, I'll mention it or whatever, and they'll immediately ask how I feel about Israel or Palestine. The way this reads is as, oh, are you a good Jew or a bad Jew? That is what I take away from that every time. It's really hard to talk about for Jewish people because it puts you in tension with the, sort of Jewish institutions and broader Jewish communities. And so just recognizing that that's kind of hard to talk about, and people will definitely let you know on their own time. I think another big one is the myth of the secret elite group. Ooh, this is hard because there is a secret elite group that controls a lot of the world, and it's capitalism. It's capitalism. But a lot of times people say or suggest that in fact it's Jews. This comes out all the time in the use of the word cabal. The word cabal comes from Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism. It is a group of people who practice Jewish mysticism. It is much better to say conspiracy when you mean conspiracy. This also comes out in undue specific focus on AIPAC, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is an enormous Jewish lobby for Israel, without also talking about the enormous, actually bigger Christian lobby for Israel. Christians United for Israel is the biggest pro-Israel funding organization. It's the biggest pro-Israel lobby in the US. So I think being very clear to talk about, if we are talking about the Israel lobby, making sure we're not just talking about Jews, but really talking about everyone who's involved is important. This also comes with the assumption that Jews or Jewish groups have a lot of money. This sometimes comes up in someone saying something like this. Oh, so you're Jewish, you must know some doctors or lawyers. I've definitely gotten that on a number of occasions. Or compliments about Jewish people being good with money. It feels like a compliment, but it's actually playing into this cycle of anti-Semitism, right? There's also this dismissal of anti-Semitism, suggesting that it's not as bad as something else or not worth talking about, an unwillingness to talk about it, an eye roll when someone brings it up as though it's not really that important. You also have here the assumption that Jews are white and have white privilege, which some of us do, but not all, excuse me. And therefore, it's not worth talking about because they have some degree of privilege, whatever. This one, I think, is the easiest to change, the ignorance of holidays or ritual. You can, on your Google Calendar, just add Jewish holidays. There's a lot. Some of them are more important than others, so it's always worth a Google, but I can't count the number of times there was a some sort of event or conversation about justice that I wanted to attend that was on a Shabbat, which is Friday night into Saturday night. All Jewish holidays go sundown to sundown, or that was on an important holiday. And then I have to make the decision, well, do I do my Jewish thing or do I do this other thing? And it's again this constant separation and forcing people to make a decision about whether they are Jewish or are a part of this community, instead of saying, well, you can be both. The other thing I would say that's very easy is providing kosher food, and understanding that on Passover or on high holy days, a couple other fasting holidays, people will have different dietary needs than they do the rest of the year. A lot of times when I've gone to an event that's on Passover, I've been I come back from work, I'm starving, I rush to this event and everyone's eating pizza. and I'm so hungry and so angry because I'm hungry that I can't really participate. And so I think that that's another easy way to make sure that you're being as inclusive as possible. Yes, sorry, Will.
We're just about out of time. But I want to just start by saying thank you so much, Jenny. And I want you to know how much my heart breaks hearing being beaten, the name for your car, what happened in fourth grade, what happened in high school. The things that you went through aren't fair; they're not right, and I feel pain that somebody who I have known and know to be a lovely person went through all of that. And thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. For folks who are new, you can check us out at New Hampshire Peace Action, nhpeaceaction.org. We have these sorts of conversations every other Monday night, 7 to 8. Our next few, we're talking about housing and housing jubilee on December 21st. We're going to be talking about what New Hampshire Peace Action's top priorities are for 2021 on January 4th. We'll be hosting Jason Wells and Deborah Opramala from the New Hampshire Poor People's Campaign to talk about the King's legacy in the Poor People's Campaign on January 18th. And then we'll have Griffin Sinclair Wingate talking about why we should be working with youth on February 1st, who's another one of our former youth New Hampshire Peace Action youth folks. So thank you, and I hope you saw all the gratitude that's been pouring out in the chat for your time and words, Jenny. And everybody have a good night.